Today marks the end of our 10th week in lockdown, 70 days of isolation and confinement. And actually it's now coming to an end here in Spain, which is great. The limitations are being lifted, we're able to go to more shops. And actually I had to restart this video just a moment ago because a plane was landing, one of the first planes for weeks. So life is beginning to change. Even the noise of the planes flying in is reminding us that life, it may not be back to normal, but it is returning. This is also my 50th story. And as I turn 50 midway through this confinement, this feels like the appropriate time to stop telling this particular series of Ebenezer stories. 50 stories to mark 50 years. And obviously my story will carry on and there's always more stories to tell. But for me, this has been a really lovely process. I've really enjoyed it. In fact, it's definitely been so far the highlight of these weeks of confinement, because I think there's something in the process of looking back at your story and telling those stories with gratitude, praising God actually in your testimony. That is a brilliant way of getting through a really hard time. It's interesting, isn't it? So there's something in the practice of remembrance, of using our memory, of looking back and then actually verbalizing those things, whether it's in celebration or in thanksgiving or in telling a story or in telling the next generation our story. Those two things go hand in hand. It's interesting, isn't it? Romans 10, it talks about believing in our heart and declaring with our mouth. There's something about bringing things back to mind, back to our heart, meditating on them, chewing on them, and then declaring the truthfulness of that is somehow intrinsically linked in our faith walk. And so I've really appreciated actually this chance to look back at my life and to tell these stories. I started 10 weeks or so ago with the story of Hudson Taylor, the pioneer China inland mission worker who went to China, and how on either side of his bed he had two scrolls with Chinese characters written on. And one of them it said Ebenezer, which means up to this point God has helped us. And on the other side of his bed the scroll said Jehovah Jireh, God will provide. And my stories have all been about ways that, as I look back over the years of my life, particularly my years living outside the UK, I can see the places where God has helped me, God has provided, God has taught me. And I'm existing in this place in the middle. If you like, I'm in Hudson Taylor's bed. I'm in this moment between the past and the future. I'm in a moment when I don't know what the future looks like, but I do know that as I look back and I see remarkable stories of God's goodness, God's provision, God's help, I know that in an uncertain future, God will continue to provide. God will continue to help me. And so I really believe that the act of remembrance, the act of reflection, and the act of declaration are really significant to our faith journey. I've heard it said that the unexamined life is not worth living. That might be hyperbole, but certainly we don't simply learn from experience, we learn from reflecting upon our experience. We learn from bringing things back from the past and thinking about them, examining them, evaluating them, praying into those things and drawing lessons out from it, and then holding on to those things and declaring them, passing them on to future generations. Just before this lockdown period started, the very final thing I did pretty much before I couldn't do anything else, I went to France for a week. I went to Le Ruchet, which is a debrief centre close to Geneva on the Swiss border. It's in the mountains. It's a beautiful place. And I went there for a week debrief. And I was just at the point where I was laying down a specific role that I'd been in for several years. I was laying down a leadership role after 6 years in that role. And I wanted a time where I could debrief it, where I could bring closure to what had been an up and down season, as every season of life is. And so I met up with about a dozen other people, and we had a week that was a guided, reflective retreat week to help bring closure to that season of my life. And it was actually a really fantastic week. I really enjoyed it. The week was built around the story of the disciples on the road to Emmaus, how this is shortly after Jesus had been crucified, he's been buried. There are reports that he has been resurrected, but the disciples haven't yet seen him. And they're walking on the road to Emmaus when Jesus appears and starts walking with them. And one of the disciples says to Jesus, "We had hoped." And he continues to talk about the things that they had hoped. They'd hoped for a Messiah. They'd hoped for a conquering king who would defeat the Romans. They had hoped. And their hopes had been dashed. It hasn't worked out the way they wanted. They are disillusioned. They are sitting in this place of unfulfilled hope. And we talked on this retreat about how in our roles we often have places of hopes that haven't been met, of expectations that haven't been met. And the fact that on this pilgrimage, on this walk that we're on, often Jesus, well, not even often, always, Jesus is walking alongside us, and often we don't realise it's Jesus. Often even we can be talking to him and our heart can be burning inside like it was for the disciples, but we don't recognise the presence of Jesus with us. When we do recognise the presence of Jesus, when we get his perspective, our story begins to change. As part of the debrief, an exercise we had to do was to create a timeline. And I was looking back over about 5 or 6 years and I literally drew a large sweeping S-shaped timeline on a piece of A3 paper. And then we had to look back over these 5 years and look for, and then we used the letter C, look for things that were changes, concerns, criticisms, conflicts and crisis. Looking for those moments and maybe writing some thoughts down about those specific incidents. And then we began to talk about them with a debriefer. And recognising that in those moments of change and crisis and conflict, there has become an accumulation of loss. And loss leads to grief and a grief process and the need to work through and allow ourselves to grieve some of those losses that have come with change and with deep concerns and with criticism. Some of those things that I wrote down on that sheet of paper are stories that I've told. Leaving South Africa, going through a crisis, the death of a close friend, having a slipped disc. And it was a really healthy process actually to talk about it with people, to be given permission to sort of sit in this place and recognise that these things were hurts. They were losses that I'd carried and maybe not actually verbalised or recognised that they were losses and that there was a grieving process that I needed to go through. And so it was a really, really healthy process. Towards the end of the week, we wrote certain things down. Maybe we needed to forgive particular people. Maybe we wanted to release things to God and we wrote them on a piece of paper and we nailed them to a wooden cross. And then afterwards we took all those pieces of paper and we burnt them in the fire. And there was something in that act of forgiveness and release and destruction which really helped me release things, give them over to God and find a new measure of closure and release. And that was really, really healthy and I really enjoyed it. Another thing that I really enjoyed that week, which I kind of did on my own as a sort of a parallel track, I also mapped, as well as the losses, I mapped the gains of those past 5 years. The relational gains, the adventures, the lessons that I'd learned, the ministry in the fruit rather in ministry. And it was very interesting when I mapped these on to the same sheet of paper that very often the gains actually were happening at the same time as the losses. For example, I recognised during that season that the gain for me of learning to swim only came out of the loss of hurting my back. And so it was really interesting to see, even in grief, even in loss, there's blessing and there's fruitfulness. So this was a really, really healthy process for me. Actually, to be honest, the highlight of the week for me was that it snowed. I've had years without snow and it was really lovely to be in a place with good snow. And on the Tuesday of the week, I think it began to snow. So I had about 4 days of good snow. So every single day I went out for walks and for runs and I loved it. And there's a mountain, well, a hillside behind Le Ruchet, Montmouret. And I went up on top of that hill several times. And one morning I got up really early while it was still dark, went out with my head torch and I went up the snowy climb up onto the ridge, and I sat on the ridge and watched the sunrise, and it was a moment of absolute beauty. And this was towards the end of the week, and I gathered a bunch of stones that were on top of the ridge and I created a cairn on top of the ridge, and literally I made an Ebenezer pillar. And for me, this was a significant moment. I took a selfie, of course, by this cairn, and I took a beautiful picture of the sun rising with the cairn silhouetted against the sunrise. But there was something in this physical act of building a stone pillar in the icy cold and the snowy ridge where there was no one else around, watching the sunrise and saying to God, yes, you've been with me, even through this time of grief and loss and challenges that I've talked about this week. You've been with me. And so I'm marking this moment. And it was lovely. It really was a special kind of private moment on top of this hill, just marking the moment. And so in the future, that moment on top of the hill literally will be an Ebenezer moment for me. I didn't stay there. I sat there for half an hour. It was getting colder and colder. The sun was beginning to come up. And eventually I left my Ebenezer pillar and I ran down the hill, ran all the way back to La Ruche, had a quick hot shower and then sat down and had a lovely big hot breakfast. I didn't stay at my Ebenezer pillar. It was a moment of remembrance, but it wasn't a place to live. It's interesting, isn't it, that Peter, James and John, all the Gospels record them going up the hill with Jesus. And on top of the hill, Jesus is transfigured. Something happens to him. He's shining white. And he appears with the prophets. And Peter says to Jesus, Lord, shall we make 3 tents here? There's something, and Jesus says no. That there's something that in Peter's desire, he wants to live in that mountaintop moment. Maybe actually he would have been better to say, Lord, shall we build a pillar here to remember this moment? Shall we build an Ebenezer pillar? I think that's probably what was happening inside Peter. He wanted to mark this moment. It was significant. It was a moment in time. I don't know if Peter could write. It would have been really good if he went home and journaled that night. But there was something in him that wanted to stay in that moment. It's very easy to want to live in my Ebenezer moments. But the reality is that life moves on. Life is a journey. And so I came down off the mountaintop and I went home for breakfast. As I look back over these 10 weeks at these different stories, many of them have been mountaintop experiences. Some of them have been valley bottoms. Some of them have been wildernesses. And most of our significant moments in life are those moments of highs or lows. They're moments in our pilgrimages. But these are Ebenezer stone moments. It's been fantastic for me to tell these stories. So probably 12 or 15 of these stories were specific stories about when I was 22, 23 years old and I had my 1-year trip across Africa. And I'd written 250 letters home to Miranda. And those letters literally have sat in a large Ziploc bag in storage for 27, 28 years. I'd looked at them sometimes, but I'd never read them all the way through. So this process of reading through 250 letters, and that's a lot of letters. Each letter is 1,000 to 2,000 words, so that's between 250,000 and 500,000 words. There's something, though, in the process of going through that and reliving those moments, which has been so healthy, so good for me to look back and see, yes, God was there. God was in that moment. And I don't want to let those things go. Those stories that I've told, they're for my children. They're for the next generation. In that first story that I told as well, I quoted Deuteronomy 29:29. The secret things belong to the Lord, but the things revealed belong to us and to our children forever, so they can walk in all the ways of the Lord. The secret things belong to God, but he reveals some things to us. And once he's revealed them, they belong to us. They're part of our story, our life story. It tells us in Proverbs as well, Proverbs 25, verse 2, that it is the glory of God to reveal things, but it's the glory of kings to search them out. It's our glory to search hidden things out. And God loves to reveal them. And when he's revealed them to us, they belong to us. They're part of our journey. They're part of our inheritance. And we are called to pass them faithfully on to the next generation so that our children can walk in all the ways of the Lord. So for me, these Ebenezer stories, and they're just a selection of stories, there are plenty more things like this in my life, just as there will be many, many things in your life. These stories, these pillars, these memorial moments are moments we can look back and say, at this point, I know God did this. In the future, this period of isolation, this COVID-19 pandemic, this will be a major Ebenezer pillar in all of our pilgrimages. We will talk about this moment for years to come and the lessons that we've drawn out through this season. So I'd encourage you at this point to, if you're not already doing this, to begin to explore the discipline of remembrance. There are different ways you can do this. I talked about the Emmaus journey. You can create a timeline looking at some of your losses, your disappointments, your crises, the changes in your life, your concerns, people where they've criticised you, conflict. That's one way of looking at things. You can look at the development of your life in ministry, your leadership development. That's something that Robert Clinton does, and also Tony Stolfus in The Calling Journey. Looking at how your life has developed as a leader. And that's a fantastic exercise, and creating a timeline and looking at the specific places where God taught you. You could do it as a couple or as a family, creating a family timeline, looking at the major moves, the major transitions, the changes, the births, the deaths, the holidays, the highs and the lows, the lessons you learn along the way. Or you could do it looking at your relationship with the Lord, your faith journey. There are so many ways you could do this, but there's something in this process of remembrance and of bringing specific incidences back to mind, naming them, building a physical pillar. You might write things on a piece of paper, nail them to a cross. One time we had a very hard season in South Africa, and at the end of that season, as we believed we were coming through it, we wrote about it in a letter. We put it in a bottle, sealed the bottle, we went down to Cape Point and we threw it into the sea, a message in a bottle. And it was our way of bringing closure to that season. It was an Ebenezer moment. It marked it. It was something physical that helped us bring that season to a close. This process for me hasn't been sort of just reminiscing in a kind of romantic way. I quoted the other day Dallas Willard talking about when Jesus said that teachers of the law, her disciples in the kingdom, are like owners of a house who bring out of their storehouse treasures old and new. And as a disciple of the kingdom, I'm an owner of a house, and I've got treasures in my house that are old treasures and new treasures. I'm learning many new things at the moment in this season of isolation, but I've also got old treasures. And so for me, this 10 weeks has actually been a process of literally opening up a Ziploc bag of old stories that have lain in the attic for far too long and rediscovering some of my treasures and retelling those stories. And that process has been therapeutic, but it's more than therapeutic. It's actually sharpening my saw. It's making me more effective, because these treasures are part of what equips me as a teacher. It's holding on to these things, my inheritance, actually equips me. These are my treasures, old and new, and it's my responsibility to hold on to them, not to lock them away in an attic. And so I wonder, even as we come to the end of this story, I wonder for you, what's God challenging you with? How is God inviting you into this process of looking back at your life and remembering those Ebenezer moments and telling those stories to the next generation in whatever way God leads you to do it? The beautiful truth is that as we reflect on these moments where we know God helped us, it equips us to look forward into an uncertain future and say with incredible faith, actually, because I know that in the past God helped me in that moment of crisis, in that moment when I was down a well and I didn't know what was going to happen, God literally pulled me up. Or because I was walking on water, I got out of the boat and I began to sink, I felt God lift me up. We look back at those tangible moments, and because we know that God helped us, God led us, God was with us. We can look forward to the future. An uncertain future, we don't know what it holds, but we know the nature and the character of God as he has revealed himself to us. And that revelation means we can look forward with confidence and say, God will continue to help me. God will continue to provide. God will be my guide, even until the end.